What if everything you ever knew, everything you were told was yours by birthright, could be snatched away in an instant simply because of your gender? What if the very laws designed to protect family lines and wealth instead crushed the hopes and futures of half the population? Imagine a world where your worth, your very existence, was contingent on a man, where your dreams of owning land, of building a legacy, were nothing but cruel illusions. This was the brutal reality for daughters in 980, at a time when ancient customs and nascent legal systems conspired to create some of the most unjust inheritance laws imaginable. Number 11. The daughter's right to occupy but not own. Imagine young Elara, her hands calloused not from fine needlework, but from tending the small garden plot behind her family's modest cottage in the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. She knew every curve of the stream that bordered their land, every gnarled branch of the old oak tree that stood sentinel over their small field of barley. Her father, a quiet, stoic man, had taught her to recognize the signs of a good harvest, the subtle shift in the wind that promised rain. He had no sons, only Elara and her younger sister Lyra. When illness took him swiftly in the spring of 980, a heavy silence fell upon their home, not just from grief, but from a gnawing dread about their future. According to the prevailing customs, particularly strong in regions where land was the ultimate measure of wealth and standing, Elara, as a daughter, could not inherit the land outright, while a son, even a distant male cousin, would have automatically stepped into his father's shoes as the legal owner. Elara and Lyra were granted a far more precarious right, the right to occupy the land. This meant they could continue to live in the cottage, to work the fields, to gather the meager harvest. They could even claim the produce as their own. But the very soil beneath their feet, the timbers of their home, the rights to the stream and the old oak tree, these did not truly belong to them. Their uncle, a shrewd and calculating man named Adric, suddenly became the de facto steward of their inheritance. He was the legal male heir, even though he lived in a village 2 days' ride away and had never lifted a finger to help cultivate their land. Elara watched, helpless, as Adric arrived with his own sons, inspecting their property as if it were a new acquisition. He assured them, with a false smile, that they could stay, that he would look after their interests. But Elara knew what that meant. It meant that any decision about the land, any negotiation regarding its use, any potential sale or improvement, rested entirely in Adric's hands. One brutal winter, the roof of their cottage began to leak, threatening to ruin their stored grains and make their living space uninhabitable. Elara pleaded with Adric for funds or assistance to repair it. He listened patiently, then shrugged, claiming his own harvests had been poor and he could not spare the coin. He suggested they make do with a patch of thatch, a temporary solution that offered little real protection against the relentless damp. Elara, with Lyra's help, tried to fix it themselves, but without the proper tools or resources, their efforts were largely in vain. The injustice was a cold, constant companion. They could live there, yes, but they could not improve it, could not invest in it, could not even protect it without the permission and often the financial backing of a male relative who held the actual legal title. This law, or rather this pervasive custom, ensured that while daughters were not immediately cast out into the wilderness, their future remained perpetually uncertain. Their right to occupy was merely a temporary reprieve, dependent on the goodwill or often the whim of the male heir. It was a life lived on borrowed time, a legacy of insecurity passed from generation to generation, keeping women tethered to patriarchal authority even within the confines of their own homes. The very soil that fed them was not theirs to defend, to build upon, or to truly call their own. It was a fundamental barrier to independence, a quiet erosion of dignity that echoed through countless homesteads in 980. Number 10. The daughter's diminished portion. Imagine a bustling hall timbered and smoke-filled in a bustling trading town on the banks of the Rhine in 980 AD. Lord Frederick, a prosperous merchant and landowner, sat at the head of his long table surrounded by his family. He had 4 strapping sons, strong and boisterous, and 3 daughters. The eldest, Isolde, known for her sharp mind and keen understanding of numbers. The middle, Brunhilde, a gifted weaver. And the youngest, Gretchen, a sweet and gentle soul. As Frederick aged, his thoughts increasingly turned to the disposition of his considerable wealth after his passing. While the sons, by custom and law, were set to inherit the vast majority of his lands, ships, and trading routes, the daughters faced a very different reality. The daughter's portion, as it was often called, was a legally sanctioned, often significantly smaller, share of the inheritance, primarily consisting of movable goods, household items, or a fixed sum of money rather than valuable land or enduring businesses. This was not merely a custom. In many Germanic legal traditions and emerging feudal systems, it was codified, ensuring the bulk of the estate remained intact and within male hands. When Frederick finally succumbed to a fever, the true impact of this law became starkly clear. His eldest son, Heinrich, immediately assumed control of the family's vast merchant enterprise and the lucrative vineyards. His younger brothers were allocated their own significant parcels of land and trading vessels. Isolde, Brunhilde, and Gretchen, however, received a combined total that was a mere fraction of what any single son inherited. Isolde, with her quick wit and business acumen, received a chest of fine linens, some silver coins, and a small, rather dilapidated house in a distant village. Brunhilde was given her mother's extensive collection of weaving looms and threads, along with a modest sum for her dowry. Gretchen, the youngest, received jewelry and a few pieces of furniture. Isolde, who had often helped her father with the ledgers and understood the intricacies of his business better than her brothers, was heartbroken. She had envisioned expanding their trade routes, perhaps even establishing her own independent venture. But with her meager inheritance, such ambitions were utterly unattainable. The small house she received was too far from the trading hub to be useful for commerce, and the silver coins, while not insignificant, would soon be depleted without a consistent source of income. Her brothers, now wealthy and powerful, looked at her with a mixture of pity and condescension. They genuinely believed they were being fair, adhering to the dictates of custom and law. The diminished portion was justified by the prevailing societal belief that daughters would eventually marry and become part of another family's household, their financial security then resting with their husbands. Their inheritance was thus viewed as a bridal gift or a contribution to their new family rather than a means for their own independent prosperity or a recognition of their birthright. This was a cruel twist of fate for women like Isolde, who possessed intelligence and capability equal to or even exceeding that of their male counterparts. Their ambitions were effectively stifled, their potential locked away behind the iron gates of a biased legal system. The law ensured that the male line of descent, and thus the family's power and standing, remained unbroken and undiluted. It systematically disenfranchised women, reducing them to recipients of token gestures while their brothers inherited the true sources of power and influence. For countless daughters in 980, the diminished portion was not just a financial slight. It was a profound statement about their secondary status, a legal declaration that their dreams and aspirations held less value than those of their male siblings. Number 9. Exclusion from titles and family leadership. Imagine the ancient stone walls of the fortress, perched dramatically on a craggy peak overlooking the tumultuous English Channel. This is the seat of Lord Godric, a powerful Anglo-Saxon earl whose lineage stretches back generations. He is a man of war and politics, a loyal servant to the king, and a proud patriarch. He has 2 children, a son, Ethelred, a boorish and somewhat dim-witted youth, and a daughter, Lady Edgith. Sharp, intelligent, and possessing a strategic mind that far outstripped her brothers. When Lord Godric fell gravely ill in the year 980, the question of succession weighed heavily on the minds of all in the earldom. Under the firmly established feudal customs and emerging legal frameworks of the time, particularly strong in Western Europe, the concept of primogeniture, the right of the eldest son to inherit the entire estate, including titles and leadership, was paramount. Even in regions where some female inheritance was permitted for land, the inheritance of titles, political offices, and the direct leadership of a family or clan was almost universally denied to women. Edgith, despite being arguably far more capable than Aethelred, was completely barred from inheriting her father's earldom, the command of his fyrd, or his seat on the king's council. Edgith had spent years at her father's side, listening to his advisors, studying maps, and even, on occasion, offering betrothal suggestions during council meetings. She understood the complexities of managing the vast estates, the nuances of local politics, and the importance of maintaining alliances with neighboring lords. She was respected by the household guards, and admired by the common folk for her compassion and intelligence. Aethelred, on the other hand, preferred hunting and feasting, showed little interest in governance, and was prone to impulsive decisions. Yet, as the male heir, he was the indisputable successor. When Lord Godric finally passed the formal ceremony of Aethelred's investiture as the new earl was a public declaration of this stark injustice, Edgith stood in the crowded hall, a silent observer, as her brother, barely able to articulate a coherent promise, accepted the symbols of authority. She watched as the men who had once sought her father's counsel now turned to Aethelred, their expressions a mix of trepidation and resignation. Edgith's strategic mind, her deep knowledge of the earldom, and her innate leadership qualities were simply disregarded by the very laws designed to ensure continuity and strength. This law was founded on the widespread belief that women were inherently unsuited for leadership roles, particularly those involving military command, political negotiations, or the dispensing of justice. It was argued that their perceived emotional fragility, their primary role as child-bearers, and their eventual marriage into other families made them unreliable or inappropriate leaders. The idea was to keep power consolidated within the male line, preventing its fragmentation or transfer through marriage. The impact on women like Edgith was devastating. Not only were they denied the right to their ancestral heritage in its most powerful form, but their individual talents and capabilities were rendered meaningless in the face of rigid legal and societal constraints. Edgith knew she could have steered the earldom with wisdom and strength, perhaps even more effectively than her father. But the law did not care for competence. It only cared for gender. For her, the exclusion from title was not just a legal technicality. It was a profound denial of her identity, her potential, and her rightful place in the legacy of her family. Proud lineage continued, but a crucial part of its future, the brilliant mind of Edgith, was utterly extinguished from its formal leadership. Number 8. The burden of inherited debt without assets. Imagine a bustling port city in the Byzantine Empire, around the year 980 AD, where ships from across the Mediterranean docked, laden with exotic goods. Here lived a merchant named Demetrios, a man whose ventures were as ambitious as they were perilous. He had a wife, Theodora, and 2 children, a son, Nikos, and a daughter, Ioanna. Demetrios was a man of grand ideas, often borrowing heavily to finance his next big venture, convinced that the next shipment would bring him immense fortune. Ioanna, unlike her brother, was keen on the details, often trying to make sense of her father's confusing ledgers. While Byzantine law allowed for some limited inheritance rights for daughters, particularly concerning movable property and dowry, there was a deeply unjust nuance when it came to debts. It was a common, unwritten rule: often reinforced by legal precedent and cultural expectation that the family's financial obligations, especially when assets were scarce, could fall disproportionately on daughters, even if they received little to no corresponding wealth. The rationale was often tied to the perceived male responsibility for family assets and the female's subordinate financial status, or simply the expediency of claiming payment from whoever was present. When Demetrios's final, ill-fated voyage ended in shipwreck and ruin, he left behind not a treasure chest, but a mountain of debts to various creditors across the city. Nikos, his son, was away serving in the imperial army, and thus insulated from the immediate fallout. Ioana, however, was at home. Her father's creditors, aggressive and unrelenting, descended upon their house like a flock of hungry vultures. They demanded payment, and in the absence of a male heir on sight, they turned their attention to Ioana and her mother. Their meager possessions, the valuable silks Theodora had inherited, the few pieces of furniture, even the humble cooking pots, were swiftly catalogued and seized, but these did not cover the full extent of Demetrios's debts. Creditors, invoking their rights under the city's customary practices, demanded that Ioana and her mother enter into servitude or sell themselves to work off the remaining balance. Ioana, with her sharp mind, argued that she had inherited no land, no ships, no substantial assets from her father, only his name and the now empty shell of their home. How could she be responsible for his massive debts? The law, or rather, the practical application of debt collection in 980, had often cared little for such distinctions, especially when a readily available female relative could be coerced. It was a cruel irony. While daughters were largely excluded from inheriting the benefits of wealth, they were often vulnerable to inheriting the burdens of poverty and obligation. Male heirs, if they were present, would typically inherit the entirety of the estate, including debts, but also the means to pay them off. Daughters, however, could find themselves stripped bare by debts they had no hand in creating and for which they had received no corresponding assets. Ioana and Theodora were forced into years of arduous labor, their lives reduced to a ceaseless struggle to repay a debt that was never truly theirs. Nikos, when he eventually returned, was able to reclaim some of his father's distant, previously overlooked assets. But the immediate crushing burden had been borne by his sister and mother. This specific injustice highlighted the precarious position of women. They were often deemed secondary in the distribution of wealth, but became primary targets when financial ruin struck. For Ioana, it was a life irrevocably altered, a testament to a system that allowed women to bear the heaviest loads with the fewest rewards. Number 7. Male guardians' absolute control over inherited assets. Imagine the fertile plains of Lombardy in what is now northern Italy. Around the year 980 AD, Lady Sophia, a woman of noble birth, found herself in a unique yet ultimately stifling position. Her father, a kind and progressive count, had decreed in his will that Sophia, his only child, should inherit a small but prosperous villa and its surrounding vineyards. This was a rare concession, as most land in this region would have gone to a male relative, however distant. However, the prevailing legal customs, rooted in ancient Roman law but adapted through Germanic tribal practices, imposed a crucial condition. Sophia, as a woman, could not manage this inheritance herself. She required a male guardian. This law, or rather this deeply ingrained societal and legal requirement, meant that even when a daughter was granted a portion of inheritance, be it land, money, or goods, she rarely had direct control over it. A male guardian, typically her father, if alive, her husband if married, or a brother, uncle, or even a male relative chosen by the family, if she was unmarried or widowed, would be appointed to manage her assets. This guardian held immense power, making all decisions regarding the property, its income, and its use, theoretically in her best interest, but often with little accountability. Upon her father's death, Sophia's distant cousin, a stern and ambitious man named Marcello, was appointed her guardian, Marcello quickly assumed control of the villa and vineyards. Sofia, who loved the land and understood its rhythms, tried to engage him in discussions about the next harvest, about selling the wine to new markets, or about repairing the crumbling walls of the villa's storehouse. Marcello listened patiently, often nodding, but then made his own decisions, frequently dramatizing his own burgeoning estates and interests over Sofia's. The vineyards, which had once flourished under her father's careful stewardship, began to decline. Marcello, busy with his own affairs, neglected the proper pruning, failed to invest in new equipment, and sold the wine at prices far below its true worth, often to his own associates. Sofia watched, her heart aching, as her inheritance dwindled, its potential unfulfilled, its beauty slowly fading. She had the legal right to the property, but none of the power to protect it or make it prosper. Her voice, her intelligence, her deep connection to the land were all rendered irrelevant by the guardian's absolute authority. This law was justified by the pervasive belief in the legal and social incapacity of women. They were deemed too emotional, too naive, or simply too weak to handle financial and legal matters independently. Their male guardians were seen as necessary protectors, ensuring that the inheritance was not squandered or mismanaged. However, in practice, this system often led to exploitation. Guardians could use the assets for their own benefit, siphon off profits, or make decisions that, while legal, were detrimental to the female heir. There was little recourse for a woman who felt her guardian was mismanaging her property, as the legal system was designed to uphold the guardian's authority. For Lady Sofia, her inheritance became a source of profound frustration rather than security. It was a gilded cage, offering the illusion of wealth, but denying her any true agency. She was a landowner by name, but a mere spectator in the management of her own fortune. This specific injustice ensured that even when daughters were granted a material inheritance, their autonomy and economic independence remained firmly curtailed, binding them to male control for their entire lives. Number 6. Dowry as the full and final inheritance. Imagine a vibrant, sun-drenched village nestled in the rolling hills of Catalonia, a region bustling with emerging feudal arrangements and lingering Visigothic legal influences. In 980, young Isabella was the eldest of 3 daughters in a family of prosperous farmers. She watched as her brothers, strong and sturdy, were taught the intricacies of crop rotation and animal husbandry, knowing that one day the ancestral lands would be theirs. Isabella, however, understood her destiny was different. Her future was tied to the concept of the dowry. The dowry, or dot in many parts of Europe, was a traditional payment or transfer of property from the bride's family to the groom or his family upon marriage. It was considered a contribution to the marital estate, often meant to provide for the wife's sustenance during marriage and in widowhood. However, in many societies of 980, a deeply unjust custom, which often carried the weight of law, dictated that this dowry was considered the full and final inheritance a daughter would ever receive from her paternal family. Once the dowry was paid, her claim to any future inheritance from her parents' estate was irrevocably extinguished, regardless of how much wealth her family accumulated thereafter, or how much land her brothers inherited. When Isabella's parents began arranging her marriage to a young man from a neighboring village, the negotiations centered heavily on the dowry. Isabella's father, being a man of means, provided a substantial dowry: a small flock of sheep, several bolts of fine wool, a good chest of household goods, and a considerable sum of silver coins. It was a respectable dowry, ensuring her a place in her new husband's household. Isabella's 2 younger sisters would follow a similar path in due course. Years later, Isabella's parents passed away within a short time of each other. Her brothers, who had remained on the ancestral farm, inherited everything: the sprawling fields, the olive groves, the sturdy stone farmhouse, the livestock, and all the accumulated wealth their parents had built over decades. Isabella, despite being a loving and devoted daughter, received nothing further. She visited her childhood home and saw her brothers flourishing, their families growing, their wealth increasing. She remembered her father's broad fields, which she had helped tend as a child, now entirely in her brother's hands. Her dowry, while useful at the time of her marriage, seemed a paltry sum compared to the vast inheritance her brothers had received. This law was founded on the principle that the dowry was a daughter's share of the family wealth, paid out at the appropriate time of her marriage, thereby settling her claim. It was seen as a way to prevent the fragmentation of family estates through too many female heirs, and to ensure that the male line retained the primary inheritance, particularly land. The belief was that, once married, a woman became part of her husband's family, and her financial security became his responsibility, not her birth family's. For Isabella, and countless women like her, the dowry, while offering some security at the outset of marriage, effectively severed their ties to their birth family's ongoing prosperity. It meant that, regardless of future windfalls, or the fact that her brothers might squander their wealth, her financial destiny was sealed by that one transaction. It created a system where women were literally bought off from their birthright, ensuring that the lion's share of enduring wealth remained within the male lineage. It was a legal mechanism that ensured daughters were transient members of their birth families, their ultimate belonging and financial future residing elsewhere, while sons were permanent fixtures, rooted in the ancestral soil. Number 5. Loss of inheritance upon marriage without family consent. Imagine the grand drafty halls of a noble family in the heart of France, in the kingdom of the Franks around 980 AD. Lady Genevieve was the youngest daughter of a powerful count, her future meticulously planned by her ambitious father. She was destined for a strategic marriage, one that would secure alliances and strengthen the family's already considerable landholdings. Her father had made it clear. Her dowry would be substantial, but her inheritance, should she receive any supplemental provisions beyond that dowry, was entirely contingent upon her obedience to his will, particularly regarding her choice of husband. In many parts of Western Europe, especially among the nobility, the concept of a consensual marriage was less about mutual affection and more about strategic alliances and the preservation of family power. Therefore, a daughter's marriage, without the explicit consent of her father or male guardian, was often considered a grave transgression. This grave transgression could lead to severe penalties, including complete disinheritance. The law, though not always written in explicit code, was enforced through social pressure, custom, and the practical application of power by the family patriarchs. Any small portion of land, any valuable jewels, any rights that might have been informally set aside for a daughter could be summarily stripped away. Genevieve, however, had fallen deeply in love with a young knight, Sir Henry, a man of courage and integrity, but of far lesser birth and means than her family's expectations. Their love was a dangerous secret, blossoming amidst the rigid formalities of court life. When her father announced her betrothal to an elderly, wealthy duke, Genevieve, in a desperate act of defiance, eloped with Henry. They married in a small, clandestine ceremony, believing their love would overcome all obstacles. The Count's rage was swift and absolute. He immediately disowned Genevieve. Not only was her prearranged dowry revoked, but any informal promises of land, any cherished family heirlooms, any financial support that might have been extended beyond her dowry were entirely withdrawn. She was formally declared an outcast, her name almost erased from the family records. Her small plot of land that was set aside for her, a gesture of goodwill from her mother, was immediately seized by her brother. She was no longer considered a part of the family's economic or social fabric. This severe consequence was a powerful tool used by patriarchs to control the marriages of their daughters. It ensured that women were primarily pawns in political and economic games, their personal desires secondary to the family's strategic interests. By threatening disinheritance, families could force daughters into advantageous, albeit loveless unions, thereby securing their wealth and standing. The law was designed to prevent the fragmentation of estates and to ensure that new alliances were forged through approved channels, not through romantic whims. For Genevieve, her act of defiance, though born of love, came at an enormous cost. She found herself utterly stripped of her birthright, her status, and her access to any familial wealth. Her life with Henry, while filled with love, was one of constant struggle and limited resources, a stark contrast to the life of luxury and privilege she had once known. This injustice highlights the brutal reality for daughters in 980. Their inheritance was not an inherent right, but a conditional privilege, entirely dependent on their absolute obedience to male authority, particularly in the realm of marriage. Price of love could be disinheritance, a cruel lesson etched into the lives of countless women. Number 4, daughters receiving only movable goods, not land. Imagine the vast sprawling estates of a wealthy magnate in the newly formed Holy Roman Empire, a land of powerful dukes and burgeoning towns. Around 980 AD, Lord Reinhold was the patriarch of a respected family, possessing hundreds of acres of fertile farmland, dense forests, and productive mines. He had 2 sons, steadfast and strong, and a daughter, Ingrid, known for her sharp intellect and deep love for the land, often spending her days among the farmers learning about the cycles of growth and harvest. While some regions might have allowed for daughters to inherit small parcels of land, the overwhelming custom and often codified law in much of Western Europe during this period dictated that land, the primary source of wealth, power, and social standing, was almost exclusively inherited by sons. Daughters, if they received any inheritance at all beyond dowry, were typically given movable goods. These included items like jewelry, clothing, household furnishings, livestock, or perhaps a sum of silver coins. These were valuable, certainly, but they lacked the enduring wealth, generating power of land. When Lord Reinhold passed away, his sons, as expected, inherited all the land, the forests, and the mines. They became powerful landowners, their futures secured, their status elevated. Ingrid, however, received a magnificent dowry for her impending marriage to a lesser noble, and beyond that, a chest filled with her mother's jewels, fine tapestries, several ornate pieces of furniture, and a handful of well-bred horses. While these items were beautiful and valuable, they did not confer lasting economic power or social leverage. Ingrid understood the profound difference. The jewels could be sold, the tapestries would eventually wear, the horses would age and die. But the land was eternal. It produced food, timber, and minerals year after year. It supported families, provided a stable income, and was the very foundation of noble power. Her brothers, with their vast land holdings, commanded armies, hosted elaborate feasts, and wielded significant political influence. Ingrid, with her chests of movable goods, was merely a well-adorned wife, her influence limited to her husband's sphere, her economic destiny tied entirely to his fortunes. She often walked the boundaries of her family's estate, looking at the familiar fields, knowing they were no longer hers in any meaningful way. She remembered her father teaching her about crop rotation, about the best times to sow and to harvest. All that knowledge, all that connection to the land, was now irrelevant. She possessed items of luxury, but not the bedrock of wealth. This law was based on the deeply ingrained patriarchal belief that land must remain within the male lineage to prevent its fragmentation and to ensure the continuity of family power and name. It was also seen as a way to maintain social order, with land ownership tied to military service and political responsibility, roles largely reserved for men. Movable goods, being easily transferable and less integral to the core power structure, were deemed appropriate for daughters. For Ingrid, this injustice was not just about the material loss. It was about the loss of potential, the loss of a tangible connection to her heritage, and the loss of true autonomy. She had the intelligence and the passion to manage vast estates, but the law had decreed that her inheritance would consist only of ephemeral tokens, while the true source of power and prosperity remained firmly out of her reach. It was a stark reminder that in 980, a daughter's share was rarely enough to build an independent future, only to embellish her marital role. Number 3. Inheritance tied solely to marriage. No marriage, no inheritance. Imagine a quiet, contemplative young woman named Sorcha, living in a small, isolated community in Ireland, where ancient Celtic customs mingled with the emerging influence of the Church. Around the year 980, Sorcha was the youngest of 5 children, and her parents, subsistence farmers, struggled to make ends meet. She had 2 older brothers already married and working plots of land inherited from their father, and 2 older sisters both married off with the meager dowries their family could afford. Sorcha, however, held a secret desire. She wished to dedicate her life to scholarly pursuits, perhaps even joining a monastic community rather than marrying. In many societies of 980 AD, and particularly in regions where land was scarce and families were large, a daughter's access to any form of inheritance was inextricably linked to her marriage. The expectation was that a daughter would eventually marry, and her financial provision would come in the form of a dowry or a specific portion of the marital estate contributed by her father. If a daughter did not marry, for whatever reason, whether by choice, lack of suitable suitors, or infirmity, she often received no inheritance at all, or perhaps only a bare subsistence, leaving her utterly dependent on the charity of relatives. When Sorcha reached marriageable age, her parents began to feel the pressure. They had already expended their limited resources on their older daughter's dowries and their son's land. There was nothing left to give Sorcha as a dowry, and without one, no suitable husband would take her. They urged her to reconsider her intellectual pursuits, suggesting she seek out any available man, however humble his prospects. Sorcha, firm in her convictions, refused. Her parents, bound by custom and economic necessity, were forced to make a difficult choice. Since Sorcha would not marry and thus would not secure her place in a new household with a dowry, they explained, there was no portion of their already stretched inheritance left for her. Their land, their few livestock, their tools, all were destined for their sons and their families, ensuring the continuity of the farm. Sorcha was told that if she wished to remain at home, she would do so as a dependent, a burden, without any claim to the property or its produce. She was expected to earn her keep through domestic labor, essentially as an unpaid servant in her own childhood home. This law, though often an unwritten societal rule enforced by dire economic realities, ensured that daughters were channeled directly into marriage. Marriage was seen as the only legitimate pathway for a woman's economic survival and social integration. It was a mechanism to offload the financial responsibility of daughters onto another family, preventing them from becoming a burden on their birth family's dwindling resources. For Sorcha, the choice was brutal: abandon her intellectual dreams for a forced marriage, or face a life of destitution and dependence. She eventually sought refuge in a nearby convent, finding a measure of solace in its quiet halls, but forever cut off from her family's meager but essential inheritance. This injustice underscored the extreme vulnerability of unmarried women in 980 AD. Their very existence was tied to their marital status, and without a husband, they often had no legal or social standing to claim any part of their birthright, condemning them to a life of perpetual precarity. Number 2. Preference for any male relative, no matter how distant. Imagine the ancestral lands of a powerful Saxon chieftain in what would soon become the Kingdom of England. Around 980, at Beacon. The chieftain, Lord Cynric, had only one surviving child, a daughter named Ælfgifu, known for her sharp mind, her strong will, and her deep knowledge of the family's estates and the local people. She had ridden with her father since childhood, learning the boundaries of their lands, the names of their tenants, and the intricacies of local governance. Lord Cynric adored her, and in his heart, he wished she could inherit his chieftainship. However, the powerful Germanic legal traditions, particularly the evolving principles of primogeniture and agnatic succession, descent through the male line, were absolutely dominant. These customs dictated that inheritance, especially of land, titles, and leadership, must pass through a male heir. If there was no direct male heir, a son, then the inheritance would pass to the nearest male relative, no matter how distant that relative might be, or how little connection he had to the immediate family or the land. A daughter, even an only daughter, even one who was demonstrably more capable, was invariably passed over in favor of any male. When Lord Cynric was ambushed and killed by a rival chieftain, the question of succession became urgent. Ælfgifu, grief-stricken but resolute, stepped forward, ready to assume her father's duties. She knew the lands, she knew the people, and she was fiercely loyal. But the elders of the community, bound by age-old customs, shook their heads. The law was clear. The inheritance of the chieftainship, the vast lands, and the family's wealth could not pass to a woman. Instead, the search began for the nearest male relative. After much deliberation and the tracing of convoluted family trees, a distant cousin named Oswulf was found. Oswulf was a man whom Lord Cynric had barely known, a rough, uncultured individual who lived several days' ride away and had never set foot on their ancestral lands. He was chosen simply because he possessed the correct anatomy and the right, albeit tenuous, claim to the male lineage. Ælfgifu watched in agony as Oswulf, a stranger, arrived and immediately began to assert his authority. He knew nothing of the land, nothing of the people's customs, and nothing of the delicate political balance her father had maintained. He was crude and disinterested, seeing the inheritance merely as a means to personal enrichment. He dismissed Ælfgifu's advice, ignored her knowledge, and soon began to alienate the very tenants her father had protected. This specific injustice was perhaps one of the most frustrating and demeaning for capable women. It wasn't just about being passed over for a brother, it was about being passed over for anyone male, even a complete outsider, with no merit, competence, or emotional connection to the family or its heritage. The law was less about preserving the family's well-being or the best interests of its people, and more about adhering to a rigid, gender-based hierarchy. For Ælfgifu, the loss was profound. It wasn't just a loss of wealth, but a loss of identity, purpose, and the chance to lead her people with wisdom and strength. She saw her father's legacy, the land he had loved and nurtured, fall into the hands of an unworthy stranger, all because of a single immutable factor: her gender. This law was a stark declaration that male blood, however diluted or distant, was infinitely more valuable than female competence, devotion, or direct familial connection. It ensured that the male line, however tenuous, always prevailed, cementing a patriarchal order with unyielding force. Number 1. Total exclusion from land inheritance. Imagine the stark reality of rural life in a small, isolated village in the Frankish kingdom, a place where the rhythm of existence was dictated by the seasons and the unforgiving demands of the land. In the year 980, here lived a young woman named Lisbeth, her hands calloused from years of toil in the fields, alongside her father and older brother. Their family possessed a small but vital plot of land, enough to feed them, to provide a modest surplus for trade, and to ground their very existence in the community. Lisbeth had always known the land was their lifeblood, their heritage. The most pervasive and devastating inheritance law targeting daughters in 980, and particularly prominent in territories influenced by the Salic law and its various adaptations across Western Europe, was the almost total exclusion of daughters from inheriting land. While specific variations existed in different regions, some might allow a daughter to inherit if there were absolutely no male heirs left in the entire family line, or if the land was explicitly willed to her with male guardian oversight. The overwhelming default, the ironclad rule, was that land belonged to men. When Lisbeth's father, a quiet, hard-working farmer, succumbed to a sudden fever, a shadow of despair fell upon their humble household. His only son, Lisbeth's elder brother, had tragically died the previous year in a hunting accident. Lisbeth was now the sole surviving child, but this did not mean she would inherit the farm. The law was clear: land could not pass to a woman. Instead, the land, their home, their few livestock, their very means of survival were automatically slated to pass to the nearest male relative, no matter how distant. In Lisbeth's case, this meant her father's cousin, a man named Otto, who lived several days' journey away and had never shown any interest in their family or their farm. Otto was a rough, opportunistic man, eager to expand his own holdings. He arrived within weeks of Lisbeth's father's burial, accompanied by his own kin, and began to assert his new ownership. Lisbeth pleaded with him, explaining her years of labor on the land, her deep knowledge of its soil and seasons, her family's unbroken connection to it for generations. She argued that she could manage it, could work it, could make it prosper. Otto simply laughed. "The law is the law, girl," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Land passes to men. You are a woman. You can either stay on as a servant, or you can go." He offered her no share of the harvest, no portion of the livestock, nothing. She was expected to leave, perhaps seek work as a domestic servant in another village, or rely on the meager charity of the church. The home she had known her entire life, the fields she had watered with her sweat, the very earth that contained the graves of her ancestors, all were now irrevocably lost to her. This law was the bedrock of patriarchal societies. It ensured the continuity of powerful family names and the concentration of wealth and power in male hands. Land was not just property. It was the source of authority, military strength, and social standing. By excluding daughters, these societies ensured that women remained economically dependent, their status derived solely from their fathers or husbands. It was a mechanism to prevent the fragmentation of estates, to maintain clear lines of succession, and to reinforce the male-dominated social order. For Lisbeth, the total exclusion from land inheritance was not merely a legal technicality. It was a complete erasure of her future, a violent uprooting from her very identity. It meant a life of perpetual insecurity, dependence, and arduous labor for someone else's gain. It denied her the right to build a legacy, to provide for her own family, or to stand as an independent member of her community. It was the most brutal, the most common, and the most fundamentally unjust of all the inheritance laws targeting daughters in 980, a legal custom that condemned countless women to lives of profound disadvantage and systemic disempowerment.